Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams of the Institute of Peace and Prosperity. Daniel, good to see you today.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. Well, there's a very special event occurring today. It's about time. The Americans and the Cubans are signing a document that says that we will have diplomatic relations and we're going to have embassy opened up in Cuba. That, of course, is something that when I was in office and you helped so much on trying to get better relations with Cuba and move this along. But it looks like this is going to happen, but my guess is that it's not going to be snap our fingers and everything back to normal. What are the things that we have to contend with other than open the embassies, which is very, very important, because I remember when the embassies were closed. So this is a big event, but we have to contend with some other people who object to this.
Yeah, I think we should be optimistic because this is a process that began a couple of years ago, and it really is, you know, one of the good things on Obama's legacy if it continues to go through. You know, there are pitfalls. The embargo is still there. We still can't do business. We still can't openly travel. So there are a lot of other things that probably you would consider more important than an expensive building in Havana toward having real relations. But as you were saying, the history is really quite interesting of how we came to be.
Yeah, and you know, the things that we want to move it along more will depend on the people's attitudes. When there's enough, even though I think the majority are with us right now, but there's still a lot of agitation in the Congress, and the Congress rightfully has something to say about this. But you know, if you look back at how this came about, because you know, during your lifetime, we've never even had an embassy in Cuba.
And I'm not a young guy.
It's been a while. So, yeah. But I do remember it because I'm a couple years older than you are. And that was during Eisenhower's administration. Of course, he was very, very popular. He was there 8 years, a war hero and all. But the more I study history, the more I find out that behind the scenes, Eisenhower was not exactly a non-interventionist, but he did keep us out of major conflicts, but there was still agitation that led to problems. For instance, he was agitating in Vietnam back then, and which led to problems. But he had a lot to do with this breakdown with Cuba, because he was a very, very strong supporter of Batista, which, generally speaking, as I recall, we all supported Batista. He's against this Castro, and we don't know who he is, and he could be a communist and all. But it turns out that Batista wasn't exactly an easy guy to defend. I mean, he had been elected president between 1940 and 44, and then was decreased in favor and lost. So he left Cuba, came to America, stayed in America until he saw an opening in 1952 to run. Matter of fact, that's the year Eisenhower was running too. So he goes back and runs, and he was doing very poorly. He knew he couldn't win the election. That was back when they were still having election. So he had a coup, military coup, with the assistance of the United States government. And that was more or less the beginning of it. So this whole idea, I remember hearing the stories. I would deliver newspapers, so I read the news, and I'd listen to the news on the radio. And back then, they would say that the people, you know, were in favor of this because you know, Batista was a good guy, but it turns out that he was in cahoots with big business, because they said, because the story was, the Cuban government, this new government, has taken over the oil wells, which was the same argument for the Middle East, which was true, but were they taking it over from really private owners, or were they taken away from a corporate fascist system that was denying so much to the people? I think so much of that was going on, and that's why people were sympathetic with avoiding support of Castro.
Well, that's like what happened throughout Latin America in the early 50s. You know, look at Guatemala with United Fruit. You know, the U.S. companies would go in and demand a monopoly, and if that president or that leader gave him that, then he could stay in power, and as soon as he had second thoughts, he was out.
And you know, when Castro, I don't know whether he had firm communist beliefs. He was firmly opposed to Batista. That was the real problem. So once he secured power in '59, it took him a couple years. He secured power, and one of the first things he did, he sent out overtures to the United States government. and that was to Eisenhower. And various things occurred. So Eisenhower, at the end of 1960, because the election had already occurred, he put on sanctions. He was the first one to put on sanctions, and this was further driving a wedge between us, in spite of the fact that Castro was looking for an association. And then, because things were getting rougher between the two states, that is when Eisenhower, guess what he did? He closed the embassy. So it was in January, shortly before the inauguration of that, I guess, a Kennedy at that time. That was when the relations were severed. And then we subsequently had Bay of Pigs. And immediately, when we turned down any overtures with Castro, that we became very, very much involved in trying to overthrow the government of Castro, because we wanted to put our guys back in
power. It makes you wonder, because did the U.S. push Castro into Soviet arms through their policy? And it reminds you of what's happening now with the U.S. and the dollar decline.
I think it's very similar. Our big problem, though, is that, say, we wanted to be friends with Batista, and maybe that could have been legitimate, but we end up giving them weapons and agitating and supporting them financially. That's where the problem comes. So we should have, had an open door policy, at least talk to them. But yes, this definitely pushed them in that direction, because we put sanctions on their sugar. And Russia came in, the Soviets came in. All right, if they won't buy your sugar, we'll buy your sugar. If they won't sell you this stuff and they're going to embargo these goods, we'll sell them to you. So it didn't work. But in principle, sanctions are bad. It leads to more problems, and people like sanctions. Probably the argument back then was, yeah, we don't like them, but we're not going to send in the troops to overthrow Castro, even though they sort of tried to with the Bay of Pigs, which was a total failure. So they keep trying to stay out of it militarily and pretend that we're not involved. And these terrible people, Batista was not, a very nice person. It is estimated he could have killed up to 20,000 Cubans in his ability to take over.
So he was our dictator.
Yeah, but he was our dictator. And I have another interesting fact about this. I wonder how they rationalize all this, because we join these international groups, the World Trade Organizations, and this is supposed to facilitate trade. Well, Cuba's been in it since 1995. So did it do any good to facilitate trade? Our argument has generally been that whether it's fast track for anything that goes on or NAFTA, it's dealt as a political tool, and we usually can control it. But if the WTO truly was there to promote free trade, we'd have been penalized. But we weren't. The other countries were. As a matter of fact, we had almost universal support, against Castro.
I know you're very optimistic about the embassy reopening and this whole process of restoring good relations, but we talked about it before the show that embassy to embassy, government to government, that's not necessarily what you'd consider normal relations.
No, I think it has to be the people, and I think the less the governments are involved, the better. They should facilitate it. And that's about it, and serve as representatives in a foreign country. It could be pretty well reduced, in what they're doing. But to go in and regulate trade and send our CIA agents into these embassies and all these kind of things, and we get a bad reputation for this. And when we're very powerful, we get away with it, but eventually we don't.
You could also see a scenario like happened in Eastern Europe after the wall fell. Of course, it was a positive development, but you had American cronies getting together with East European cronies. They used to be communists, and they very quickly changed their stripes, and they all got together and did business deals, and the same people who were victims of the system stayed victims because they didn't have access.
Yeah, and I do argue the fact that the people have to be supportive of a certain position, and the people can eventually, win the day. And I think that has been happening. It always happens too slowly. But now, the American people are much more open. Statistics show this. When I was campaigning in the presidential campaign, young Cuban Americans were all for opening up the door. The older people, ones who were more involved with the old-time financing and all, they never came around on it.
you made a good point, though, that the embassy being open is a positive thing. However, there could be negative consequences. We know that even under the Obama administration, there have been several attempts to overthrow the government. One was, if you remember, the Zunzuneo scandal, where the USAID was covertly putting a fake Twitter system into Cuba, hoping that young Cubans would overthrow their government. So whereas it's positive, it still could be a beachhead for the interventionist to say, now we can get him.
Yeah, and that always backfires too. You know, we're tough on negotiations with Iran. Hopefully that'll soften up too. But when we get tough and put on sanctions, or we unify the people who might naturally organize to throw out a particular government. But it seems like Cuba doesn't have the greatest history of independence. Of course, it went from the Spanish to the Americans, and I imagine if we go over the entire history, we probably didn't, treat them a lot better. But one argument that they use and people generally go with, and if the demagogues in Washington say, we can't do this, I mean, this is horrible, there's a violation of civil rights, human rights in Cuba, and we'll never, never, never give an inch. And yes, Batista violated civil liberties, and Castro has as well. And but we don't read or get stories. If there was mass abuse of civil liberties and human rights in Cuba, we'd be hearing something about it. So that is really past. But why I was annoyed by this and made the point, in Congress, that we shouldn't do that because these people aren't perfect. I said, when we have a perfect system here and we have perfect protection of civil rights here, then maybe we can lecture. But even then, we shouldn't be lecturing. But that's the whole thing. We write laws to protect whistleblowers. And look at how we took care of Kyriakou, who told us about, torture. And he's the only one that went to jail, not the people who broke the law. And here we have an Edward Snowden who tells us the truth about our government, and he's essentially a man without a country. And nobody in this country believes he'd get a fair trial in this country, and he would get zero credit for trying to tip us off and tip the American people off. But the biggest job is for us to overcome the propaganda that the government spews out, as well as the media, because I think the people will be receptive to this. Would like to thank everybody for tuning in today. I think this issue of Cuba and U.S. relationships is something that is not going to go away. It's going to be talked about, but we're on the right track, moving in the right directions. We should never depend on sanctions and boycotts and all these things to try to intimidate people. I think if we truly want to help people get along, that we should not be doing this. And people say, well, you can't do this with the bad guys. Well, just think back, not too long ago, we were military allies with one of the most ruthless countries of all history, and that was with the Soviets. So this excuse that we can't talk to certain governments because they're less than perfect, well, look to ourselves for perfection. That's where we should be working on it. But in this area, I think we should give Obama some credit for this, to moving in the right direction, and I hope he keeps moving in the right directions with negotiations with the Iranians. Thank you very much for tuning in to the Liberty Report, and come back soon.